was coming up with tonight's episode, I was really reminded of Rosemary's Baby. Okay, you've seen it, yes. I know that because the movie is so old and I do not care about ruining it for you because the movie is literally like 40, 50 years old. You need to watch it if you haven't. I was reminded of that scene at the end where Rosemary has just had her baby and they told her that she lost it, but then she starts hearing crying in the walls and she starts to wander around her apartment complex. And then she comes to that room where there's all these creepy old people just kind of waiting around this bassinet. And then she looks inside and there she sees her baby, but she doesn't recognize it because it kind of probably looks like a goat baby. Well, spoiler, the movie is about a woman who has the son of Satan. Actually, maybe they don't even gender the baby. Sorry, that's my fault for gendering Rosemary's Baby. Anyway, I'm just thinking about the scene of this woman who is at her most vulnerable. She's just had a baby. She's been gaslit the entire time, sedated by this group of people that are supposed to be concerned for her partner, doctors, people who seem like they should be legitimate grown-ups who are all around her, and then they trick her and take her baby and use her baby for some other malicious, nefarious purposes. And it really reminded me of the terror of this story. Tonight's episode is all about the family, one of Australia's most infamous, bizarre, cruel cults that has ever existed in that country. We're going to be talking about Anne Hamilton-Byrne, who is infamous, and last week, I believe, passed away. So let's delve into it. This video is brought to you by Shudder. Use the code NOCTURNAL for 30 days free. At Shudder, you can watch the latest videos of horror, thrillers, weird documentaries. You're going to want this. So please use the code NOCTURNAL for 30 days free. Sometime in 1964, Raynor Johnson, a noted physicist and author, started to host meetings at his home in Ferny Creek in Melbourne, Australia. His interest in mysticism, psychic phenomena, religion, and Indian spirituality led him to a young yoga teacher named Anne Hamilton-Byrne. The members of his group were locals from the area, mainly made up of nurses and medical personnel. They came to call themselves the family. Their philosophy was a mix of Christianity and Hinduism, with the influence of popular gurus of the time. It was also believed that Anne was the reincarnation of Jesus Christ. Many cite Anne's beauty as a seductive quality of her recruitment. Much of the language about her is a sexist depiction of her as some sort of temptress who cast a spell over the men and women around her, especially Raynor Johnson. Because female cult leaders are much rarer than male cult leaders, it's hard to compare, but it's interesting to me that so much of the blame of how this woman got so many people to trust and follow her was by seducing them. Anne is kind of a peculiar case. I really had a lot of trouble finding information about her. It was difficult finding photos or interviews or even information about where she was born or if she had siblings. You see, Anne isn't actually her real name. Her real name is Evelyn Grace Victoria Edwards. For the sake of this video, I'll keep referring to her as Anne. She had a troubled childhood. She was the eldest of 7 children. Her mother was a schizophrenic who was hospitalized several times, and Anne spent many years in the old Melbourne orphanage. At 20, she changed her name permanently to Anne Hamilton and married the father of her only biological child. He died in 1955. It was around this time that Anne began exploring religion and yoga. Anne began teaching yoga around Melbourne and gathered followers from her classes. These women would later become the aunties to Anne's brood. After Anne met Raynor, she labeled him her John the Baptist, and his wife and daughters joined the family. During the late 1960s into the 70s, The family began recruiting new members at the nearby New Haven Hospital, since so many members were already hospital staff there. Rayner had many friends and associates who were lawyers, doctors, teachers, and psychiatrists, and he introduced them all to Anne. One of them was New Haven psychiatrist Howard Whitaker. Anne needed medical staff in her circle because part of her own practice was the ingestion of psychedelics and tranquilizers in a ritual that she called going through. The control and administration of drugs was crucial to her maintaining control. Drug use was a part of the spiritual practice, and magic mushrooms were referred to as sacred mana. Many patients were given LSD, and it is believed that the connection to the hospital was how Anne began acquiring children. By doping up patients already suffering from psychological afflictions, doctors and staff were able to convince or coerce people to give away their children to Anne. With the help of her affluent devotees, Anne began acquiring property around Australia, England, and America. By 1995, her daughter, Sarah Hamilton-Byrne, judged the total amount of Anne's wealth being, quote, at least $150 million by all of her real estate properties. Anne's philosophy, her reason more bizarre. She convinced all of the other members that they had to acquire more children so that they could repopulate the earth after the end of the world. Anne even had all of the children bleach their hair so that they would look all the same, maybe reminiscent of some sort of perfect Aryan race to rebuild the world. Anne and Bill were seldom around, and the children faced unimaginable amounts of cruelty. They had a rigid routine, up at 6 a.m., yoga, meditation, more yoga, schooling, listening to Anne's sermons, more meditation, more sermons, with a small, bland vegetarian meal in between. Many times the children appeared pot-bellied and stole food or ate bird seed or grass if they were hungry. Anne was fearful of her children not being perfect, and if she thought they were getting too overweight, she would restrict their diets and give them vitamin tablets and tranquilizers to calm them. A child referred to as Cassandra, who was 11 at the time she was taken from the compound, weighed only 44 pounds and grew 4 inches once she left. If children disobeyed her or failed in any way, they were subject to intense beatings, starvations, and public humiliation. Even if a child was sick, they would be punished for being attention-seeking. The irony was that love and care for animals was heavily preached, while the beating and abuse of children was encouraged. One of the mantras of the cult was, quote, a belting a day keeps evil away. The children, just like the members, were given drugs like LSD to keep them docile and obedient. Suffering, Anne taught, was just how Jesus ascended to heaven, and that suffering was the way to increase one's karma. So really, she was doing the children a favor by torturing them. Anne's half-assed cultural appropriation meant she didn't have to know anything about Hinduism or reincarnation or Christianity. She could just make it up as she went along to further her own agenda. In 1987, 3 girls broke away from the group and went to the police to report what was happening on the properties, and on August 14, 1987, all children were removed from the premises in a raid. Anne and Bill fled Australia for 6 years to avoid punishment and dollars each. The family was under surveillance for several years by local law enforcement, who were suspicious of the activity going on in the properties. In the 1980s, a child named Helm was reported missing by her father. Her mother, Patricia Helm, was a member of the family, so the police went to the compound to retrieve her. A judge ruled that the girl be returned to her father, and Patricia and Kim disappeared. A week later, they were found in Auckland using false names. This began the media's exposure to the cult. In 2016, a documentary was released at the Melbourne International Film Festival called The Family. It delves fuller into the children's experience inside the group, detailing their abuses and the emotional trauma that they still suffer. On June 13, 2019, Anne Hamilton-Byrne, self-described Jesus Christ, died at the age of 97. I had this story on my list for a while, but once I heard about her death, I decided it was an appropriate time to make the video. I really don't understand Anne at all. Maybe it was her pathology, maybe she had a little bit of the schizophrenia that her mother had, or the mental illness that was passed on in her family. Why steal so many babies that you don't even want to raise? Babies that you ignored most of the time? Why go through all of the trouble of doping up women in hospitals so that you can steal their babies, separating families so that you could spend most of your time in vacation in upstate New York? After the raids of '87, many members began to leave the cult. Children were then reunited with their birth families or placed in foster homes, and the family's popularity waned. Bill Hamilton-Byrne died in 2001, and by 2013 it was reported that Anne was close to death and suffering from dementia. And Ben Shenton, who was part of the family at 18 months, said the cult had become, quote, a toothless tiger. With the death of Anne, it seems like the legacy of the cult has no chance of a final resurrection. Former Victoria Police Detective Lex DeMann, who led investigations into the cult, said he had received a number of confirmations on Friday that Hamilton-Byrne had died. Quote, "The normal reaction when you receive the news of death of someone is one of sadness," he said. "It's quite the contrary for me today. Today was a great day in that now she is dead. She can rot. The lives she affected and her evil deeds, I shed no tear, not a drop." Unquote.